Imagine a woman whose fate was about to be sealed by her husband's reckless decision. In the ancient land of Israel, in times of kings and warriors, there was a woman named Abigail. Her wisdom and courage would make her a key figure in a story that many would never forget. Abigail lived in Maon, a small town in the desert, alongside her husband Nabal, a wealthy man but with a harsh character and irritable temper. He owned vast properties and flocks, but did not share his wealth with generosity. His behavior was as rough as the mountains of Judea, where shepherds tended his sheep. And it was precisely this lack of wisdom on Nabal's part that would put them in grave danger. On the other side, David, the young man who had been anointed as the future king of Israel, was still living as a fugitive. He wandered the deserts, pursued by the jealous King Saul. Along with his men, David protected Nabal's lands and shepherds from thieves and invaders. In return, he expected a simple gesture of gratitude. Once, during the sheep shearing season, a time of great celebration and abundance, David sent messengers to Nabal, asking for food for himself and his men. After all, they had protected his properties for so long. However, Nabal, arrogant and selfish, responded with disdain. "Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse?" he scoffed, refusing to offer any help. His servants, who knew the true character of David, feared the worst. The insult was severe. David, enraged, gathered his men and, sword in hand, marched toward Nabal's house. His heart was filled with fury, and he swore he would not leave a single man alive in that household by dawn. Vengeance was certain and blood would be spilled. But Abigail, upon learning of what had happened, understood the danger approaching. She knew her husband had made a fatal mistake, and so, without wasting time, she decided to act. With remarkable wisdom and quiet courage, Abigail prepared a peace offering. She loaded donkeys with bread, wine, meat, and dried fruits, a generous meal, and went to meet David before he could reach her home. The journey through the desert was swift and filled with tension. Each step brought her closer to a confrontation with a man on the verge of committing a massacre. What would Abigail do when faced with the feared warrior? She knew the fate of many depended on her words and actions. Could she stop a bloodbath? This is the story of Abigail, a woman of intelligence, courage, and above all, faith. Her unexpected action would change the course of an imminent tragedy, and her deeds would be remembered as an example of how one person can make all the difference. Night was approaching, and the shadows of the mountains stretched across the desert as Abigail and her servants hurried along. The silence was heavy, broken only by the sound of the hooves of the donkeys loaded with provisions. With every step, Abigail's heart beat faster, for she knew that the lives of many were in her hands. The approaching conflict was inevitable, but she was determined to face it with wisdom. On the other side, David was full of rage. Alongside his armed men, he advanced with heavy, determined steps. Why would Nabal dare to scorn me? He, a mere man, dares to defy the future king of Israel? David thought. Hatred consumed him, and he was ready to spill blood. For him, his honor was at stake, and Nabal would pay dearly for his insolence. Meanwhile, Nabal's servants watched in fear. They knew their master's behavior had been disastrous, and many began to lose hope. However, in Abigail's heart, there was conviction. She could still prevent the worst. When Abigail saw David and his men, she did not hesitate. She quickly dismounted from her donkey and, without delay, knelt before the future king. The desert sand rose around her, but she held her humble position, lowering her head in a sign of respect. This caught David's attention. He stopped abruptly, surprised by the unexpected scene before him. Abigail, with a firm yet reverent voice, began to speak. "My lord, the fault is mine. Please, pay no attention to Nabal, for his name reflects what he is, a fool. I did not know that your servants had come to our house. Had I known, I surely would have provided what was needed. Please, accept this gift that I have brought for your men. Do not shed blood without cause. You are chosen by God, and it would not be worthy of you to stain your hands with vengeance." Abigail's words echoed in David's heart. Her courage and humility disarmed the warrior who had been ready for battle. He looked around at his men who were waiting for his orders, and then turned his gaze back to Abigail. With wisdom, she reminded him of God's plan for his life. David was destined for something greater, and he should not let himself be consumed by fury and the desire for revenge. For a moment, silence fell. The tension in the air was palpable. David, moved by Abigail's words, began to reconsider his intentions. Moments before, he had been prepared to destroy Nabal's entire household, but now he found himself before a woman who, with her words of peace, brought light to his path. "You are right," David said in a calmer tone. "Today, the Lord has sent you to stop me from making a grave mistake. If it were not for you, I would surely have shed innocent blood. Go in peace, and may the Lord bless you." That moment changed everything. David, the feared warrior, renounced his vow of vengeance, touched by Abigail's wisdom and courage. He accepted the peace offering, and his hands, which had once gripped the sword thirsting for blood, now lowered it, allowing mercy to triumph. Abigail stood up, relieved but still cautious. She knew that Nabal was unaware of the danger that had nearly befallen them. The return home would be difficult, as she would have to deal with the consequences of her actions. But for now, peace had been restored. The massacre was avoided, and many lives were saved by the intervention of a woman who knew how to act at the right moment. Abigail returned home with her heart still racing, but with the peace of knowing she had averted a tragedy. She had faced an enraged warrior, and with wisdom calmed David's wrath. However, her husband, Nabal, was still oblivious to what had transpired. When she arrived, Abigail found him in the midst of a grand feast, drunk and celebrating as if nothing was wrong. The contrast between the tension she had lived through and Nabal's carefree attitude was shocking. She knew that this was not the time to tell him what had happened. Nabal, drunk and out of control, would not be able to grasp the seriousness of the situation. So, Abigail waited. The silence of the night gave her a chance to reflect on the events of the day. The courage she had shown in facing David surprised even her, but now she had to prepare to deal with the consequences of her actions at home. The next morning, when the effects of the alcohol had worn off, Abigail approached Nabal cautiously. She knew her words had to be chosen wisely. With a firm but calm voice, she recounted everything that had happened. She described the imminent danger Nabal had brought upon their household through his recklessness and how she had interceded to save their lives. Nabal listened in silence. As Abigail spoke, the color began to drain from his face. The impact of his wife's words seemed to deeply shake the man who until then had always considered himself untouchable. When she finished, the silence in the room was deafening. Suddenly, Nabal collapsed. The news was such a shock that his heart seemed to fail. He became paralyzed, like a stone. For 10 days, Nabal remained unresponsive until, finally, his life slipped away. The Bible recounts that the Lord himself took Nabal's life as a judgment for his foolishness. With Nabal's death, a decisive turning point occurred in Abigail's life. The woman who had once lived under the shadow of a reckless and cruel husband was now free from his control. But this was not the end of her story. Upon hearing of Nabal's death, David, who still remembered Abigail's courage, sent a message to her. He saw not only her wisdom, but also her noble character. It was then that David made an unexpected decision. He asked Abigail to marry him. For many, this might have seemed like a surprising outcome. Abigail, who had saved her household from tragedy and shown uncommon wisdom, would now become the wife of the future king of Israel. Her life was taking a new direction, moving from a situation of fear and uncertainty to a position of honor and respect. Abigail's life was not just marked by Nabal's death, but by how she faced challenges. Her story is a powerful reminder of how a single action, motivated by courage and wisdom, can change entire destinies. Now, Abigail was about to enter a new phase of her life, where alongside David, she would play an important role in the history of Israel. But even with this new responsibility, her courage and wisdom would continue to be her defining traits. Now, as David's wife, Abigail found herself in a new position of power and influence. But with this change came new challenges and responsibilities as well. She was no longer just the woman who had saved her household from an imminent massacre, but a prominent figure alongside one of the most important men in Israel. The transition was not easy. Abigail had moved from a relatively isolated life, dealing with the difficulties imposed by Nabal, to being involved in the complex affairs of David, who was still living as a fugitive, pursued by Saul. The constant tension between the future king and the current monarch of Israel required a new kind of wisdom from her, not only to mediate conflicts but also to sustain hope for a better future. In David's camps and hideouts, Abigail faced situations that tested her resilience. The environment was one of constant uncertainty, with imminent battles and the ongoing threat of enemies. Despite this, she remained a figure of serenity and counsel, always ready to offer words of encouragement and guidance. Her emotional intelligence and ability to read situations made her a valuable ally to David. During this period, Abigail had to cope with the hardships that came with life alongside a military leader. She encountered the brutality of battles, the loss of friends, and the uncertainties of a future that could at any moment be interrupted by Saul's sword. Yet she remained steadfast, never allowing fear to dominate her. The relationship between David and Abigail also began to deepen. David, who had initially admired Abigail's courage and wisdom, came to trust her, not just as his wife, but as an important advisor. She increasingly became a strategic partner, someone who understood the challenges he faced and who knew how to handle the complexities of his position. At the same time, Abigail underwent a personal transformation. She needed to leave behind the trauma of her marriage to Nabal, the man who had been a source of pain and frustration in her life. This emotional transition was not immediate, but Abigail, with her unwavering faith, found the strength to move forward. In her moments of reflection, she recognized that, despite all the hardships she had faced, she had been shaped by these challenges. She had become stronger, wiser, and more prepared for what was to come. Her ability to overcome adversity, both in the past and in the present, was a reflection of her deep faith in God. Abigail knew that even in the face of the greatest trials, the Lord was by her side, guiding her steps and protecting her future. This conviction kept her steady, even when the circumstances around her seemed dark. Over time, Abigail's story would become an example of how a woman can not only survive challenges, but overcome them in a dignified and honorable way. She showed that true strength does not lie in great armies or wealth, but in wisdom, faith, and the courage to act when the moment demands it. Now, she was ready to face anything alongside David, the man who would one day become the great king of Israel. Together, they would face new battles, new enemies, and above all, new trials that would demand everything Abigail had learned throughout her life. Abigail knew that despite being by David's side, peace was still far off. David remained a man on the run, and Saul's kingdom continued to rise against him. Days passed, and the tension between the two men only grew. With every report of a confrontation, Abigail felt the weight of uncertainty on her shoulders. But her trust in David, and above all, in God, kept her steadfast. The decisive moment arrived when David was given yet another opportunity to confront Saul. Although he had had other chances to take the life of his pursuer, David, in his integrity, had chosen to spare Saul, believing that it was the Lord who should judge the king. Abigail, with her wise heart, understood David's hesitation and encouraged him to wait for God's timing. However, the external pressures were immense. Many of the men following David began to question his leadership. They were tired of living as fugitives and longed for a decisive confrontation. David's loyalty was being tested, and Abigail knew that the future of all those who followed him was at stake. Time was running out, and a major decision needed to be made. One night, after a series of ambushes and escapes, David gathered his closest leaders to discuss the next step. The silence in the camp was palpable. The weight of the choice David had to make affected everyone. He stood up and looked around at the men, seeking strength to announce his decision. But before he could speak, Abigail approached, her eyes filled with determination. She asked for the floor, and everyone, including David, turned to her. Abigail, with her calm but firm voice, reminded David of the value of his integrity. She spoke about the future he would have as king, and the importance of keeping his hands free from unjust bloodshed. "God has chosen you," she said, "and the Lord will lift you up in his time. You don't need to stain your conscience with personal vengeance." Her words resonated deeply with David. He knew Abigail was right. His anger against Saul could lead him down a path of no return. Once again, his wife's wisdom guided his steps, preventing him from acting impulsively. Silence filled the air, and David, with a deep sigh, agreed. He would not raise his hand against Saul. However, fate would act unexpectedly. Just a few days after this decisive conversation, news arrived at David's camp. Saul had died in battle, and the throne of Israel was vacant. The moment David had waited for so long had finally come, but not by his hand. The Lord himself had removed Saul, just as Abigail had said would happen. The news brought a wave of emotions. David's men rejoiced at the fall of their enemy, but Abigail felt something deeper. She knew that the true challenge was just beginning. David's reign would be marked by great victories, but also by immense responsibilities. As his wife, she would have a vital role at his side, not only as an advisor, but as a pillar of wisdom and strength. In that moment, Abigail realized that although they had avoided a massacre years before and escaped conflict with Saul, the real battle for David and for her was just beginning. The battle of leading a nation with justice and faith, while facing new enemies and challenges. With Saul's death, David finally ascended to the throne of Israel, fulfilling the promise that God had made years earlier. But with the crown came new and complex responsibilities, and Abigail, as his wife, found herself in a position of great influence. The path to this point had been difficult, filled with battles and challenges, but Abigail knew that the greatest test of her life was yet to come. David, now king, needed to consolidate his power and deal with the tribes of Israel, uniting the people into a solid and prosperous kingdom. The transition was not easy. Many of Saul's followers still resisted, and the enemies surrounding Israel took advantage of the political instability to attack. But behind the palace walls, Abigail remained the voice of wisdom. She was not a queen seeking power or wealth. On the contrary, Abigail kept her heart focused on God and on the good of the kingdom. In the most tense moments when difficult decisions had to be made, David turned to his wife. And whenever she spoke, Abigail offered words of balance and discernment, reminding him that true power came from his faith and the justice he practiced as the leader chosen by God. In the years that followed, Abigail played a crucial role behind the scenes. While David dealt with the matters of government and war, she remained his closest advisor. With her intelligence and patience, Abigail helped maintain unity within the court and pacified internal tensions. Her influence was not seen publicly, but within the palace walls, she was an unshakable pillar. Over time, people began to realize that behind the great King David stood a woman of extraordinary wisdom. Abigail had become an example of how one person's faith and courage can shape the destiny of a nation. Her story began to be told throughout Israel, and many saw in her a model of justice, integrity, and obedience to God. However, her life alongside David also brought personal challenges. Amid his triumphs, the king had to deal with family conflicts and betrayals, and Abigail, as both wife and counselor, felt the weight of these adversities. Still, she remained steadfast, knowing that their mission was greater than their own personal struggles. As the years passed, Abigail became respected not only as the king's wife, but as a central figure in the history of Israel. She, who had once prevented a massacre and changed the course of history, now saw her influence extend across generations. And despite all the difficulties she had faced, she knew that every step of her journey had been guided by God's hand. At the end of her life, Abigail looked back with gratitude. The massacre she had prevented had not only saved her own household, but had also paved the way for David to become the great king of Israel. Her courage and wisdom had changed the fate of her people and brought peace in times of conflict. Now, her story was told as a testimony to the power of faith and action guided by God. Abigail, the woman who acted with intelligence and compassion, became a legend. Her life proved that even in the midst of the greatest difficulties, God's plan always prevails. And so ends the incredible story of Abigail, the woman who, with her wisdom and faith, prevented a massacre and shaped the destiny of a nation. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments what impressed you the most about Abigail's life. And take a moment to tell us, did you already know this story? What other biblical stories would you like to see here on the channel? God bless you, and see you next time.